The Houston Cougars are set to get into the Big 12 this fall. They face a familiar foe that they haven't seen in a long time, but only for 1 year. Let's jump into it.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a crossover edition of Locked On Cougs and Longhorns. I'm one of your hosts, Parker Ainsworth, joined by Jonathan Davis. Jonathan, how you doing?
Doing good, man. Excited for Houston to come to the Big 12 and excited to renew this rivalry for 1 year only.
For one year only. I'm sure the Houston Cougar faith will be making jokes about dodging smoke and things like that. Can I ask you, as you're leaving the Big 12 and heading into the SEC, as a foundational member of this conference, right? Some people would argue a fairly big financial part of the start of this conference.
Just a little bit.
What are you looking to get out of last? Obviously, like titles and rings and stuff. Like, what kind of a year are you looking at having in your last year in the Big 12 as the conference expanding to 14 teams this year?
Yeah, well, a lot of people are looking ahead to the SEC, but, Texas has high expectations this year, especially if we're talking about football. And, it's been a while since Texas has won a Big 12 championship, right? Too long. And so we feel like, this last year in the Big 12, it seems wide open. You have to play the games, but right now it seems like there's a wide open path for Texas to get to the Big 12 championship game and win it. I feel like Texas has I wouldn't say by far, but I do think Texas has the most talented roster in the conference. And so I think that's the expectation for Texas fans this year is in your last year in the Big 12, maybe the easiest path to a conference championship you'll have for a while going to the SEC with Alabama and Georgia. This is the year to get it done. So I think that's where Texas fans are focused right now. But I want to ask about U of H fans because you're coming to the Big 12, which would seem like a step up in competition. So what are the expectations for Dana Holgorsen and the Cougs this year on the football field?
Honestly, I think there's people all over the map. So Dana's been in the Big 12 before. So as far as a coach, I think there's not like an adjustment for Houston in that perspective. I think Houston and Central Florida are both unique perspective because Central Florida has Gus Malzahn. He's coached Power 5 football before, right? The deal is that people are worried about like some of the more like depth chart kind of things. I think people feel comfortable in the like starting lineup, but as you know, in the Big 12, by the 4th minute of the third game, you're playing your third string left tackle. Just something crazy can happen. And so you got to be ready to go with anybody on your 85-man roster. I'd say that's probably the biggest. And then we have a quarterback battle happening that I'm sure get into at some point because who knows what's going to happen with all of that. Talk to me some about as the Texas Longhorn, you mentioned they have a great roster, and I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer here, Jonathan. There's been a lot of times in the last dozen years that I feel like you could say Texas had a great roster. And Houston fans will walk and say, hey, those are some kids from like this area, right? They'll recognize some of those faces. But they haven't had a great dozen years. They've had some peaks. I don't mean to say like beating Georgia in a bowl game wasn't a big deal or whatever. But what's going to make this fall different for Texas?
Yeah, so, Steve Sarkisian did an interview on The Pivot where he said, year 3 just feels like my team. They're practicing like my team. They have speed like my team. They're talking and communicating like my team. This just feels like the year. And I don't feel like there is a definitive competitor or contender to Texas this year in the conference. Typically you had like those Lincoln Riley teams or, a Matt Campbell Iowa State team that was really formidable and might knock Texas off or, those Gary Patterson TCU teams. And I'm just not sure we have that in the Big 12 this year. So like you said, this has been the story for the better part of a decade that, Texas is the most talented team in the conference and should win the conference that season. And it just hasn't happened up until this point. But I think the biggest reason why Texas feels for real this year is because even though you lost your best player in Bijan Robinson and a hell of a running back behind him in Roschon Johnson to the NFL, I just feel like this team is more talented than they were last year from top to bottom. You're returning a quarterback, a very talented one in Quinn Ewers, which makes a hell of a difference as well. Returning all 5 starters on the offensive line, one of the best receiving rooms in the country, a very talented tight end and running back room. And this is a defense that's going to be able to more than hold their own, even though we're talking about an offensive team under Steve Sarkisian. So I just think this is the year for all of the pieces to come together. Granted, it be in the last year in the Big 12. It's time for Texas to get over the hump. I'm not going to say they're back, but it's time to get back on the road to being back. But you talked about, I talked about Quinn Ewers a little bit. You talked about Houston and, them having, I guess, semi-fair expectations this year in their first year in the Big 12. And we know that quarterback is going to be a big part of that. And quarterback is the most important position on the field. And right now, I don't know if U of H fans know who their quarterback is going to be. So shed light for Longhorn fans on who is the quarterback going to be for the Cougars this year, and how you feel about that.
Well, we know it's going to be one of two guys. We didn't have a spring game, so we didn't get to watch the competition between the two as far as play out on the field. There were practice clips and practice this and practice that. And frankly, in practice, they look like they're good at different things. So Houston's got Donovan Smith played as a 6'5", 245-pound kid. He's from Texas Tech.
Longhorn fans know. We remember him running over Jared Thompson and Diamante Tucker-Dorsey en route to victory against us last year. So, we know.
Yeah, so he does that. He does that. But his drawback would be he does put the ball in the wrong team's hands sometimes, right? He does put the ball in the wrong team sometimes. He actually played in a game when Texas Tech played Houston last year as well, and Texas Tech won that one. Houston's other option is a 6'1", squattier kid, bigger base. He transferred in the spring of 22 from Arkansas, but didn't ever get on the field there. So there's not a whole lot of game tape on what he looks like at Arkansas. So two Power 5 recruits. It's not like Houston's coming in this thing blindfolded. Donovan Smith with a little bit more experience on the field, but Coley with a little bit more experience playing for Dana. And so it looked like kind of, they're different talents or whatever. We're going to pull them in different directions. And Dana Holgorsen has maintained to this point that Houston's going to enter the year with both guys getting reps. And to be honest with you, Jonathan, and the Longhorn fans, I'd imagine even if the decision by week 3, 4, 5 is ultimately to go with Lucas Coley, you can't take Donovan Smith out of a goal line package. I mean, you guys saw that up close and personal, right? Yeah. So I imagine Donovan Smith at least plays some in every game, even if he loses out on the job. And I really think at this point, all indications are it's 50-50. The people I talked to that are at the summer practices would still say they're getting 50-50 reps. So I don't know that they actually ever pick one, but that's not necessarily the best thing either. Right?
Yeah. They say if you have two quarterbacks, you have none. So that'll be interesting to see, this year. And that was kind of the situation at Texas Tech where they had 3 quarterbacks last year and pretty much ended up with none, right? I want to ask you a follow-up question because I know, we're content creators and, it can be hard in the off season to make content. Also, when you're a fan of a college football team, you really hold on so much to the offseason in terms of recruiting, the spring game, all of that. Those are big moments for you because most teams are going, 9-10 months without football games. That's a lot, right? I mean, that's the better part of the year. So how did you feel as a content creator and how did Cougar fans feel when they found out there was no spring game, right? They weren't going to see anything or have anything to hold on to in April, right?
And the spring game got canceled about 36 hours before. So for Texas fans that don't know, it was NCAA only has so many days you can have spring practice. And Houston put the spring game at the very end of that window. There was no room for anything else. And of course, it's going to be played outside, free admission, crazy, hoping to get some excitement going in the Big 12. And of course, it's a weekend that like thunderstorms are just predicted to come sweep across the city of Houston because it's in April. Of course they are, right? And that scheduled that. And so they bumped it to an indoor practice, but the practice facility doesn't have seating and all that kind of stuff for games, right? And so there's no way they were deciding between parents and media and fans and this and that. And they really ended up making it just a practice with some extended scrimmage type possession, 2-minute drill kind of stuff and let some parents in. It wasn't any big hoopla. Recruits, I guess, got to come watch too that would have been at the spring game. Houston fans were upset or indifferent. There was really no in between. There was the people like, it's just a spring game. And then, that old school fan. And then there were people like, I don't know who's taking the snaps next year. There was both into the spectrum. But I would say the interesting to me as a content person was there was no middle. There was nobody that was like, I understand. There was only the two ends. And so I guess that's what fandom is, though, right? Fanatic. You're only one of two things.
Yeah. No, it was almost a similar situation for us, and I was hoping it didn't. I was actually planning on driving to Austin for our spring game, but the weather forecast was, potential thunder in Austin, and there was talk about them moving it to the inside facility and not allowing fans. So I ended up not going. Of course, perfect conditions. Malik Murphy goes out there and shine. Quinn Ewers goes out there and shine. So that's just my luck. But, thankfully for Longhorn Nation, we were able to, have a spring game that we were all able to watch for sure. So I feel bad for the Cougar fans on that one.
Speaking of things we're all able to watch, I know this is a college sports show, but we have some buddies over at FanDuel, and we're watching a crazy NBA Finals right now, Jonathan. And FanDuel is giving fans up to $2,500 in no sweat first bet. So you can go FanDuel.com/lockedon, get $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. They've got Game 3 of the NBA Finals with the Miami Heat as underdogs by 2.5 points. Jonathan, I know you also like basketball. We've talked Texas and Houston college basketball some in the past. What do you make of that when you see the Nuggets favored by 2.5 on the road?
Yeah, well, Vegas determined before the series that, the Nuggets were going to win this series pretty easily. I think the Nuggets were like minus 350 coming into the series, which is one of the biggest underdogs since probably the Warriors and LeBron. So, I mean, like I said, Vegas already determined that the Nuggets are just a way better team than the Heat. And so, they're 2.5 point favorites, but you can never count out, Jimmy Butler. I'm a Bulls fan. We drafted and developed him, so it's always love there. You can never count out Eric Spoelstra. So, might be some good money for the people that take the Heat tonight, plus the points are, just straight up might be some good money for those folks down in Miami.
I get that that's less than 3. I weirdly feel like it's going to be closer than that. I'm seeing like a last second shot, a 1-point win. I think I'm taking Tom Ball's own Jimmy Butler and going with it that way. But I'm telling you, wherever I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it at FanDuel.com using FanDuel.com/lockedon to get $2,500 back in a no sweat first bet. I mean, at that point, like what? Why not, right? FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Jonathan, we will talk some at the end of the video too about the hoops aspect of this renewed rivalry.
Yes,
but
sir.
Before we get too far, you mentioned Quinn Ewers. You talked about the quarterback battle. I know you didn't mention Arch Manning, who my fans would be like, I heard all about Arch Manning coming. Why didn't hear about that?
You caught me red-handed.
We're probably a year away from that, right?
Yeah.
And so about a year away, you'd say, from hearing about Arch Manning a lot more.
He's the definitive third-string quarterback behind Quinn Ewers and Malik Murphy. So, barring some crazy, injury misfortune this year, I don't think we'll see Arch Manning suit up for the Texas Longhorns this season.
Well, and he's a freshman, a true freshman coming in from a crazy lot of talent, I'm sure, but coming in from a fairly small high school program in New Orleans. I want to ask you about the rest of the names in the roster, though, because it's as much as this rivalry is fun, and it'll be great water cooler talk all week and season, and potentially a long time after that. We don't play each other again for a while. I don't know that Houston fans are that familiar with the roster outside of Bijan Robinson because he was the headliner last year, and as you mentioned, he's gone, and that's a lot of production gone.
Yeah. No, I think we have, a great deal of talent. When you look at the tight end position, we have JT Sanders and, obviously Brock Bowers is probably the class of the tight end position at Georgia right now in college football, but I'll put JT Sanders right there behind him. When you look at the wide receiver position, On3 ranked Texas as the second best wide receiver room in the country. It doesn't take much digging to find out who was number 1 at Ohio State. But Texas has that much talent in their wide receiver room. You have Xavier Worthy. You can make an argument he's the second best receiver in college football behind Marvin Harrison Jr. That would take some production on the field to solidify that this year. We talked yesterday about Jordan Whittington, people from Texas, people from the Cuero area, now how good he is, a former 5-star receiver that's going to get a lot of opportunity this year. And then A.D. Mitchell, when you bring a 2-time national champion receiver over from Georgia to Texas, he's going to have a big role this year, plus all of the receivers we have behind him. And you lost Bijan and Roschon to the NFL. Those are big losses. I don't want to paint that as anything otherwise, but I still think we have one of the most talented running back rooms in the country. We just brought in the number 1 running back from this previous class and Cedric Baxter from Orlando, Florida. So it's Steve Sarkisian, and I'm not saying this is going to be the 2020 Alabama offense at Texas, this year, but I definitely think this is going to be the most explosive version of the Texas offense we've seen since 2021. I do think there'll be a top 15 offense this year, even without Bijan Robinson. And I think this will be an offense that can carry them to 10 plus wins for the first time since 2018. But I want to ask about this Houston offense and the skill positions, because I know y'all lost one of my favorite players to the draft, Lil Tank Dale. I'm glad I'm in Houston. Across the street from NRG. So I will be checking out CJ Stroud and Tank Dell, that 713 connection in Houston. You also lost your starting running back. I can't remember his name at this point, but looks like Dion may have poached him. Right? Sorry to rub salt on the wounds to the Cougar
plucking
fans,
all the cords there. Yeah.
But Dion might have poached him. All right. So who should Longhorn fans look forward to playing against skill position wise in that matchup in October?
Well, you mentioned Alton McCaskill, and that was a gut punch in the running back room. I think the most talented position at Houston is the wide receiver room, and I know that you're saying the same thing about Texas. I feel like I would stack up. It might not be the highest touted names and stuff like that, but the Houston wide receiver room with a lot of people. Matthew Golden is a preseason first-team all-conference guy. He set some freshman receiving and touchdown and yards records last year for the University of Houston. Sam Brown was on the field a lot last year as well. He's a sophomore. He originally started at West Virginia. They pulled in a couple transfers, like a kid from Oklahoma State named Stephon Johnson. A year ago, they pulled in Joseph Manjack, a kid from USC, who then spent a lot of 2022 hurt, so people kind of forget about him. And then Houston landed one of their highest-ranked recruits in the history of modern recruiting for football, named Mikhail Harrison Pilot. They kind of lucked into that. His dad played linebacker, and his stepmom was a cheerleader. So there was some Houston in the bloodline there for sure. But he was a 5-star athlete, and he's going to come in and play receiver, I think, for Houston. But in Temple, he played quarterback and receiver and running back and safety and corner and everything. And he's going to come in and looks like he can play some wide out for Houston. And that's a lot of dudes with a lot of talent. And we also, frankly, you mentioned Tank Dell. Everyone in America knew Tank Dell was getting the football last year, and he still caught 17 touchdowns, right? So we also know Dana can get those guys open in a way that it makes me feel confident saying you're going to want to know those wide receiver names. If I'm feeling so confident in my wide receivers, it probably, we got to figure out who throws them the football. We mentioned that earlier. Who does Texas have covering these guys? Who's Texas having the defense side of the ball? Because I think the Big 12 is a league without a whole lot of defense, if I'm being frank. And what is it? It's just it's a high-scoring league every weekend, it looks like, right? So what does that mean? You look at when Texas has that. If you're trying to win the conference, you're going to have someone on that side. What you got?
Yeah. So first, before I forget to mention this, Texas fans are definitely going to be familiar with a few names in that Houston receiver room. You mentioned Mikhail Harrison Pilot. We definitely recruited him for a long time. So Texas fans that are familiar with recruiting will remember that name. Also, Jonah Wilson, former Texas commit that decommitted and flipped to Houston. I think a lot of Texas fans are going to be invested in what Jonah Wilson does down in Houston as well. So when you talk about the Texas football team and our defense, right? I think it starts with in the defensive backfield. Actually, let me push back on what you said, first of all, because you're talking bad on my conference. I'm still in the conference for years. So we're talking bad. When we got now we don't have, Gary Patterson anymore, but that TCU defense was still really good last year, right? You got Dave Aranda at Baylor, a defensive mastermind. You got Matt Campbell and Iowa State, what they've been able to do with the flyover defense at Iowa State. I think the Texas defense was much improved last year. We got Brent Venables at Oklahoma. So, it's not the air raid Big 12 anymore. Now, talking about the Texas defense, I think one of our strengths is the defensive backfield. You bring back Jaron Thompson at the safety position. Honorable mention all Big 12 last year. Jalen Catalan, the only issue about him coming over from Arkansas is health, but he's a former all SEC safety. I think that means a lot in college football. Ryan Watts, one of the best corners in college football. He returned last year. Jade Barron, one of the best slot corners. He returned. Tavondre Sweat on the defensive line. I think he's one of the best D tackles in the country. And then you brought in a plethora of talent in the last two classes, the 2022 class and the 2023 class, which included the number one linebacker in the country. So Sark is going to get all of the press. This offense is going to get all of the press. Quinn Ewers, whether he has a mullet or not, is going to get all of the press. But I think this is a defense that, like I said, can more than hold their own. When you look at Texas in their biggest games last year, it was the defense that showed up, not the offense. In the Alabama game, we held a team that averaged 45 points last season to 20, right? When we played TCU, we held them to 17. So it was the defense that showed up in those games, not necessarily the offense. I think that's going to be the case at times this year, but you're going to have a more explosive and consistent offense to go with that defense that I think improves in year 3 under Pete Kwiatkowski. But we talked all about what we're going to see on the field. But if you look on this graphic right here, we have a question that says, what's the deal with these win totals? And we're coming up on 20 minutes into the episode. And we haven't talked about these win totals. So I have to ask you, Parker, because I know the fans, they're watching on YouTube. Like, when are they going to talk about these win totals, right? Hanging at the edge of their seat. Where does FanDuel have Houston listed this year in terms of their win total? And do you and the Cougar fans agree with where FanDuel has Houston projected?
I'm calling this disrespectful. So they got Houston at 4.5 wins. And I got to be honest, there are a lot of schedules out there where we're like, man, I don't know if Houston can win 5 games on that schedule. That is not Houston's current schedule. On their 4.5 win over under, that would just be winning 2 conference games if they won all their non-conference games. Their non-conference games are UTSA, and that's a growing program, right? I don't mean to like diminish what they've done on there, but a Power 5 team ought to beat you at UTSA, right? Yeah. And then Rice and JT Daniels and Sam Houston State, right? Like theoretically, that's 3 wins in non-conference, or at least it should be. And then as far as the conference schedule goes, Houston does play TCU and Texas, but catches them both at home. Right. Those to me are anything can happen in college football. We've seen weirder things happen than Texas or TCU losing in the city of Houston. Right. Then they get Cincinnati and UCF, 2 other schools that are like Houston in the fact that they're first year in the conference. I think Oklahoma State's down. They get them at home. Houston took Texas Tech to overtime last year. Was UTSA was double. Like these are games that are all a lot of 50-50 games in the conference as far as our schedule. We also get West Virginia at home on Thursday night, right? Like a lot of games I think Houston can win. And to think that they only have to win 2 conference games to beat that FanDuel 4.5, that makes me feel like that, like, you got to go put money on that right now. Like that's too easy.
Hammer that, right? I feel the same. If Houston only wins 4 games this year, I'm going to have some question marks. So I'll probably be texting you asking what happened. So Cougar fans, if my word means anything, go hammer that over for sure.
So we have some common opponents. Y'all are projected to win a few more games.
Just a couple more.
You've also got one big one circled in the second week of the season. So talk us through the Texas schedule and what their win total. Like, what do you see them matching that? Is it 9.5?
Yeah, so it's 9.5. And what I said on the podcast when they released these is I'm confident in Texas winning 10 games this year. I'm not putting my money on it confident, right? I think those are 2 different levels of confidence, because when you put your money on it, you're expecting it to happen. And what you're telling me is if I bet the over on Texas 9.5 is that they're only going to lose 2 games this year, right? And if you feel like they're favored, they're underdogs against Alabama on the road, Alabama's going to win that game. Now you're telling me that Texas has only one other chance to slip up for the entire rest of the season, right? Assuming they don't lose to Wyoming or Rice and JT Daniels, even though, I have all the respect in the world for the former national champion JT Daniels, right? So, I think that Texas should win 10 games this year. I think they definitely have the talent to win 10 games. They'll be favored in every game they play this year, but Alabama, I'm confident in them winning 10 games in the regular season. Would I put my money on it? I'm not so sure about that just yet. But we talked about this game, and I think it's going to be interesting because Texas does play Houston on the road, and that game comes directly after our probably biggest game of the season to fans, which is the Red River rivalry with Oklahoma. And immediately after, we come down to Houston to play the Cougs. And I want to know what type of home field advantage should we be expecting? Should we be expecting a rowdy and raucous crowd down there in Houston? Or do you think there might be some burnt orange in the seats, right? Could Texas take over TDECU in Houston? How do you see that going?
I see the way they did ticket sales for that one working too. One, I think that Houston's an interesting spot relative to the rest of the conference. And Austin is a big city now, but most of the conferences like Lubbock, Waco, Norman, where if you're in that town, you're kind of just a fan of that team. There's not a whole lot of other stuff happening. And that's I got family in Lubbock. That's no disrespect to Lubbock. That's just the reality of it, right?
It's not Houston. Right. It's not Houston.
Houston's a melting pot. Alums from all of these schools live in Houston. And so I think that is a real problem and could be a real problem for Houston in a bigger picture sense. The Texas game is a separate ticket from the normal home game package because Houston has one more home game than normal this year. They got 7, I believe. It was 7 or 8. One more than whatever normal is, right? And so they're selling the Texas ticket separate. So as a Houston fan, I don't have to get a full $1,000 multi-whatever season ticket package. I can just get the Texas game. So the thought process, I think, was get as many fans to that Texas game as possible. It's a bigger draw, bigger whatever, that as an old Southwest Conference rivalry, that's one Houston wants people to show up to. What I'm worried is going to happen, though, Jonathan, because everyone has the internet, is that that's not going to be just clicked on by people from the Houston Cougars.
Exactly.
But I can imagine that being a game that people have clicked on from all over the state of Texas, or a bunch of those Burnt Orange fans that already live in Houston, or even just people willing to make a few-hour drive from Austin. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that splits. So Houston plays TCU in September, and then goes on the road to Tech, and West Virginia is a Thursday. So it's kind of, it's one of the first real tests for this Big 12 home crowd advantage. And what I've been saying on our shows it's kind of put up or shut up time, right? Yeah. Houston has been asking to be in the Big 12. They've been asking for these rivalries. They've been asking, we don't want to show up to Conference USA games. We don't want to show up to American Athletic Conference games. We'll show up when you play someone real. This is someone real. Right, like this is the time to pony up some money for tickets and go. The time of day has not been released yet, but Houston's gotten a friendly draw with TCU being at 7 p.m. on a Saturday in September, and stuff like that. Like the later games have kind of been better for just Texas heat, right?
Yeah.
Do you anticipate, Jonathan, a big Burnt Orange turnout? You're going to show up, I imagine.
Yeah, I live in Houston, so I'll be there. But absolutely, and we've seen, Big 12 schools get a little petty in the past, and try to make those tickets, against Texas or other schools. I'm not just going to make this about Texas. I'm not going to be the egotistical Texas fan that probably all the Cougar fans think that we are, right? But we've seen in the past where, Big 12 schools have made those big game tickets a part of 3 to 4 game, kind of like ticket groups, so that Texas fans or Oklahoma fans or whoever couldn't just go buy a bunch of those tickets, right? If you did, you would have to buy 3 more TCU home game tickets, et cetera, et cetera. Houston not doing that is opening the door for the Burnt Orange and Texas fans to come in and take over. So it sounds like they don't mind who's in the seats as long as they're filled up. So I do think that opens the door by them making that a single ticket. It does open the door for, Texas fans to come out in waves, and it's a national brand. It's a global brand. So yes, if it's a single game ticket, you should expect a lot of Burnt Orange in the building when Texas and Houston play each other. So we're getting close to the 30-minute mark, and we've talked a lot about football, and we both love football, right? But we're Big 12 fans, so that means we're hoop fans. And at least for 1 year, we get one of the best teams in college basketball in the Big 12 before Texas departs to the SEC. I told you yesterday, I wish all of our athletic programs could go to the SEC, and then the basketball teams could just stay in the Big 12, right? That'd be best case scenario for me. But, it is a step up in competition. I regard the Big 12 as the best conference in college basketball. And I don't think that's going to be too daunting for Houston, because y'all have more than held y'all's own, but it is a step up in competition from what you play in terms of conference games night in and night out. So what are your expectations for Kelvin Sampson and the Houston Cougars this year in the Big 12?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is they lost a lot of talent, and Jarris Walker will be a lottery pick in the NBA draft, and Marcus Sasser, I imagine, is a late first-round pick as well. And he was the Jerry West best shooting guard in all of NCAA last year. They brought in LJ Cryer as a transfer from Baylor, who was a third-team All-Big 12, and Texas fans will remember. They brought in Damian Dunn, who's a 15 points per game, 38% three-point shooter from Temple. So Houston fans know that name. I think the interesting thing is Houston could be as good as – I don't think they will be as good as last year, because last year they didn't want team in the country for a lot of the season. But on paper, they could be as talented as last year, and they're not going to go 33-4. The competition's just – like you could be really good and just run into Kansas in the Fog Allen Field.
Baylor, TCU, that might be 4 losses right there.
Well, and then if you beat them at home, you split the series with them. Like, you're good, right? That's a good basketball team, and so I think they could very easily be good with some losses on their schedule. But y'all are doing this with your third coach in 3 years, and I'm a fan of the Rodney Terry hire. I'm upset it took so long. What's your last year in the Big 12 going to look like? Because it is the best conference in college basketball.
Yeah, well, if you would have asked me this a month ago, I wouldn't have known, right? Because that's when the whole roster had decided not to play for Texas, right? And people were out on the Ronnie Terry hire a week after it happened, but him and his staff have done such a great job of, building up this roster via the transfer portal and getting back Dylan Mitchell, Dylan Dessou, and Tyrese Hunter were huge. I know you're a huge college basketball fan, so I think the world of Max Amos, bringing him in is like a stocking stuffer for me. I get to watch him in a Texas jersey and his last year in college basketball, but I think it's a big year for Texas. I mentioned TCU is going to be really good. They did some good work. Baylor, all the respect in the world for Scott Drew. They've done some good work in the transfer portal. And in Kansas, you brought in Hunter Dickerson, right? I think he was the consensus number one player in the portal across all sites, right? And then they stole Arterio Morris from us. They're going to be really good. And then you have all the other teams that are going to be competitive night in and night out. Oklahoma State, Iowa State. I mean, you're adding Houston, right? It's just a bunch of really good teams. But I think this year is imperative for Ronnie Terry to build on the success he had last year because, me and you both said that there's no question that he should have got the job based on the 2-month job interview that he had, last year after Chris Beard, whatever happened to him, really the last 3 months. But I still think Ronnie Terry has to prove himself, right? He earned the job, but when you look at Ronnie Terry's career head coaching record, it's 53%, right? He wins 53% of his games. That's not the standard at Texas. That's not going to cut it at Texas. So I think this year he's brought in a really talented roster. He's brought back 3 starters from an Elite 8 team. That wouldn't have even been possible 10 years ago in college basketball. And so I think this is the year for Ronnie Terry to go out and show and prove that he is the leader and he should be the face of this Texas basketball program moving forward. In a tough Big 12, I think he's very capable of doing that this year with this roster.
I'm excited for it. Jonathan, we're going to talk at least some in October before that game, at least some throughout basketball season about those games. And that's all assuming we don't do some Big 12 preview kind of stuff before and all that fun junk. But where can Houston Cougar fans find you? Again, you are a Houstonian. Where can people find you on Twitter and all those kinds of things?
Yeah, so Jonzo Ball, like Lonzo Ball, on Twitter. That's my personal Twitter, Locked On Horns. That's my Longhorn Twitter, and then Locked On Longhorns on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And the same for you. I know I have some, old SWC Texas fans that may be interested in listening to some Houston content, or, I got people in Houston that may root for the Cougs here and there. So where can they find you, Parker? And also let them know, you might have a big weekend coming up. So, shout that out on the podcast. We can get some congratulations in the comments.
As of the recording of this, part of the reason we're recording this, I guess, is we are having a baby this weekend. And so we're banking up some Big 12 content for the folks, the Houston side of this thing. And so thank you for that. But it is exciting time here for myself, obviously, for Houston and all those kinds of things. Locked On Cougs has been a fun project. Been doing about, I think we just started in October, so it's fairly new. And it's rolling right now. It's rolling through. You can find the show, again, Locked On Cougs, Coogs. That's how we spell it for Houston. Wherever you want to find your podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, whatever. On Twitter, I'm at Painsworth512. That's PAINSWRTH 512 on Twitter, Instagram, all your social media handles. And yeah, I might go be a little radio silent on the Twitter there for a minute, but I'm there, I promise.
Yeah, and I just want to say before we get out of here, to all Longhorn fans, to all Cougar fans, I just want to let y'all know that Parker has the second best shoe game on the Locked On Podcast Network. You already know who has the best shoe game on the Locked On Podcast Network, but that's a hell of a compliment. He's got all the J's. Nobody has more passion for Cougar sports than Parker here. I'm so blessed to work with him. Please go check him out. And Cougar fans already know you're listening to him, so good job there.
Thank you. And we always wrap with the Go Cougs. That's what so Go Cougs, John.
There you go.